post Imola. It was very, very exciting, actually. Max just about made it. Ferrari looked flustered and Stroll saved Aston Martin. Not something I usually say this weekend in Imola. So I asked you for your hottest takes from the 2024 Imola Grand Prix, and we're going to discuss them together. Let's just get straight into it. In case you missed it, this is how the drivers finished at the end of the Grand Prix. Max Verstappen won. Lando Norris just behind, less than a second behind Max Verstappen's Red Bull in second place. Charles Leclerc rounded out the podium positions in third. Oscar Piastri, again, just missing out on the podium places, fourth place. Another fourth place for Oscar Piastri this season, still yet to pick up that podium. Carlos Sainz in fifth place, getting 10 points for Ferrari. Lewis Hamilton and George Russell finishing sixth and seventh, although probably should have been the other way around. George Russell picking up the fastest lap point, but giving away points. We'll delve into Mercedes a little bit later. It was all a bit strange. Sergio Perez finishing in 8th place behind the Mercedes and by a margin as well. Lance Stroll finished in 9th place to pick up a couple of points for Aston Martin. And Yuki Tsunoda is just becoming a very, very consistent name in the point scoring places, finished in 10th. Hulkenberg, Magnussen, Ricciardo, Ocon, Joe, Gasly, Sargeant, Bottas and Fernando Alonso finished just behind and outside of the points, with Alex Albon being the only retirement from the Grand Prix. And it was a bit of a strange one, wasn't it? There was lots of things to delve into. There was a few talking points. It divided opinion, like straight off the bat, just in terms of whether or not people thought it was a good Grand Prix or a bad Grand Prix. Nobody can really make up their mind. It just seems like no one is really sure if it was a really fun Grand Prix or a really boring Grand Prix. I think it just sort of had elements of both. And depending on when you were kind of watching and concentrating, I think that's the thing with Formula One. A lot of the time, people dip in and out of it because it is a couple of hours long. I think depending on when you tuned in, there were a few things that were very exciting that happened, but there were definitely stints in the race where not a lot was happening either. And it looked like it was done and dusted. Then it came back to life. Then it looked like it was done and dusted again. And it came back to life right at the end, with Max Verstappen and Lando Norris having a little battle right at the death. Let's get straight into it then and talk about your hot takes from the Grand Prix. Alfie said, Max seemed quicker over this race weekend compared to last weekend. And I feel like it was one of those classic weekends where even though he won the Grand Prix, and okay, by the end it was a little bit in question, for the majority of this weekend, it did feel like Max Verstappen was just building up to something a bit better. Obviously, you know, at the end of the day, getting the points on the board is exactly what he wanted to do. And he felt that the hard tyres just fell out of their operating window, and it was like driving on ice for him towards the end of the Grand Prix. And that's one of the things we have heard from Max Verstappen a few times this season, and especially Friday in Imola. He was completely out of it, like made multiple mistakes that you just don't expect to see from Max Verstappen. And we haven't seen from Max Verstappen over the last 3, maybe even 4 seasons. Like, he has been pretty imperious over that lifetime. And Max Verstappen, for me, just drove around brilliantly, even with the issues, and managed to eke out just enough, had just enough in the tank to keep Lando Norris at bay. And he said himself that it got very snappy, felt like the tyres weren't gripping up anymore, but he'd still just had enough to keep eking out those tenths of a second, make sure that Lando Norris was still outside of DRS range when it came to the final lap. And that's what Max Verstappen does best. When he needs to turn on that little bit of quality, it is just there for him. And that's why he continues to win races. And that's why, even with the field closing in and with the Red Bull not looking as dominant as it was last season, Max Verstappen is still pretty much everybody's favorite to go on to win this season. And I don't know, it felt like you can't suddenly force like half a second out of the car, but Max Verstappen just seemingly can. And he was left feeling thankful to Red Bull and McLaren's rear wing choices that protected him in terms of the straights. And he'll feel like Imola was a proper win, which is something that Max Verstappen has actually talked about before, where he felt like a lot of his wins last year came too easily. Is that too ridiculous to say? Like, I don't know. He felt like a lot of the wins that he got last season, he didn't have to massively try for because the Red Bull was so far clear. And once he'd got himself into a position where he was 20, 30 seconds up the road, even with a safety car, even with a virtual safety car, even with a bad pit stop, he would still end up towards the front end of the pack. That's no longer the case for Max Verstappen. You know, we saw with the safety car rolling against him, in Miami. He lost out on the victory, which is something that would not have happened last year. And now, with a few more laps, maybe Lando Norris would have been able to nick that win. So we are seeing Max Verstappen properly under pressure now in that Red Bull car. Let's also talk about Sergio Perez, because I want to chuck in my hot take from this Grand Prix. And I felt like I was watching Sergio Perez in a very similar situation to this kind of weekend last year, is exactly how Sergio Perez's started falling off. And I'm starting to get a little bit worried. Like, I was thinking last year, I was like, when did Sergio Perez's form come into question last season? When did it start to really fall apart? And it was kind of post Miami. He had that battle with Max Verstappen, lost the victory in Miami to Max Verstappen. Then we had Monaco and he crashed in qualifying. And then from there onwards, Sergio Perez had a very topsy-turvy season for Red Bull in 2023. And he's almost started in a very similar vein already this season, you know, was up there picking up podiums, constantly behind Max Verstappen for the first few races of the season. And now we've come to Imola, which is just before Monaco, round 7 of the Formula 1 season. So again, he's had that kind of first quarter of the season that's gone pretty well. And it's just started to look a bit sketchy for Sergio Perez. I mean, the thing is, he needs to be picking up silverware, right? He needs to be on the podium. He needs to be within the performance range so that he is at least in the mix. Sergio Perez realistically should have finished around, you know, Oscar Piastri, Carlos Sainz at the absolute minimum, not falling behind both of the Mercedes cars. But he was dropped out of Q2, which again was something that we saw from Sergio Perez quite a lot last year, where he had weekends where he struggled. He did drop out in qualifying quite early in comparison to when you'd expect him to come out of qualifying. And with a pretty poor first stint on the hard compound tyres, he wasn't able to make up the places then. You were expecting Sergio Perez to be like, okay, I'm starting in 11th place, but I've got 3 or 4 drivers ahead of me right off the start line that I can kind of go for. You know, you won't expect Sergio Perez to really be held up by the RBs or even the the Mercedes cars this season, but he just wasn't able to do it. And as Verstappen's pace dropped off towards the end, Sergio Perez's pace also started to drop off on that hard compound tyre. And we saw actually the Red Bull maybe went a little bit too long on their hard compound tyre stints. First of all with Sergio Perez and then secondly with Max Verstappen towards the end, because both drivers had real issues holding onto the hard compound tyre at the end of their hard compound tyre stints. Of course, when Sergio Perez then put on the medium tyre at the end of the Grand Prix, lighter fuel, less tyre degradation, and also more grippy tyres, was going to put Sergio Perez in a position where he finally was able to make up those positions on Daniel Ricciardo, Yuki Tsunoda, Lance Stroll, for instance. He was finally able to really make those moves forward. Oh no, Lance Stroll was behind him. Who am I thinking of? Nico Hülkenberg. Nico Hülkenberg, he was able to get past as well. And it was one of those things that, okay, Verstappen showed that there is a little drop off there. There is a vulnerability to this Red Bull, but it is still the fastest car on the grid. And Sergio Perez just is starting to look like it's a bit of a weird end of it's a bit of a weird. I don't want to say the end of his season already, and the fact that he's going to definitely lose that Red Bull seat. He can definitely bounce back after this. But as I said, this was where it started to fall apart last season. And yeah, racing is epic. Combination of slightly bad form, almost equal race pace between the top 3 teams. Running in P6, I feel like a P6 finish would have been questionable, but fair for Sergio Perez. Finishing 8th is not where he needs to be. And the fact that he was only just 8th as well, he wasn't close to the Mercedes cars, he was closer to the cars behind in 9th and 10th place. that was a little bit worrying for me. Of course, you could talk about the strategy in there as well. And then on the flip side of that, we can talk about McLaren, because Josh Swain said here, McLaren can challenge for them wins, especially Lando, if things go their way. Lando showed great pace at the end. And yeah, Lando Norris and McLaren can be so happy with the last two Grand Prix in particular. Obviously, picked up that victory in Miami, but this weekend also looked so close to Max Verstappen and looked like the nearest competitor when it really counts. Obviously, there was a point in the Grand Prix where it did look like Charles Leclerc was maybe going to be able to catch and overtake Lando Norris for second place. But then Lando Norris switched it on right at the end. Charles Leclerc made a little error, which we can talk about almost in a moment as well when we talk about Ferrari. But there was a little error from Charles Leclerc, something that has happened before to Charles Leclerc. But Lando Norris then turned it on. I feel like Lando Norris almost pushed it a little bit too hard. There were a few times where we were on board and Norris was very squirmy. He was moving around the track quite a lot. And if he'd just been that tiny little bit cleaner, maybe he would have been able to get himself within DRS range of Max Verstappen. Again, lots of people saying if he had 2-3 more laps, then it would have been absolutely guaranteed. But you don't, and you have to run the race distance that is there. And you have to be able to, as a team, get your strategy right, get your car in the right position, and move towards a victory in the time allotted, right? It's all well and good saying if you had one more lap. They don't have that. But yeah, Norris provided proof that Miami wasn't a fluke, effectively. I know a lot of people saying he's super lucky with the safety car, but the pace was there after the safety car, and the pace was here this weekend as well. And if you can actually charge and put Max Verstappen under pressure, something that he hasn't really been under in a very long time in Formula One, like, that just shows where McLaren are now at in terms of their car. And by no means am I saying that McLaren are an absolute guarantee to be the second fastest team every single weekend. They're still behind Ferrari in the constructor standings. There's still a long way to go, I believe, to be properly level with Red Bull every single weekend on every single track, because that's the other thing with the McLaren car. It is very peaky. It has weekends where it's sensational. It has weekends where it's sometimes even the fourth or fifth fastest car still over the course of the 2024 season. So there is a little bit of a way to go. But I feel like the second weekend in a row where it's been toe-to-toe with Red Bull, and to be fair, considering where it was at the start of 2024 or even the start of 2023, there's an absolutely remarkable turnaround from the team, and they can be very, very positive about moving forwards. More upgrades come into that McLaren car. Again, it feels like Red Bull have kind of hit the plateau of performance. And maybe, just maybe next year, as we head into 2025 and this final year of this rules cycle, if Red Bull can't find any more, if Red Bull can't get any quicker, and everybody else keeps catching up, McLaren have put themselves in a really, really solid position. Still need to catch Ferrari in the constructor standings, though, before we start talking about them battling with Red Bull anytime soon. Although the team that are second in the constructor standings are Ferrari, and three for life says Charles is severely overrated. And I thought this is an interesting one, because on the flip, on one side, right, Ferrari, they seemed to be the closest competitor to Red Bull, but Red Bull and McLaren really did kind of step away from Ferrari a little bit this weekend, I feel. Like, particularly Lando Norris. We can talk about Oscar Piastri and the fact that he struggled with his tyres, but that comes with a little bit of experience. And I feel like on a different weekend, on a track that was maybe a little bit easier on the tyres, Oscar Piastri would have probably been on that podium place rather than Charles Leclerc. And therefore, we're looking at Max Verstappen, both McLarens ahead of the Ferraris. Like, Oscar Piastri dispatched Carlos Sainz fairly quickly during the pit stops and was able to really put the hammer down and put Charles Leclerc under a little bit of pressure, at least to begin with. And, okay, yes, it's clear the Mercedes are still miles off of it, but Ferrari had a sizable upgrade package this weekend, and, you know, they're the big three, like Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes, I feel like are still the big three in terms of winning championships, winning races over the last few eras of Formula One, to be honest with you. And that sizable upgrade you expect from a team like Ferrari that is in that caliber. I know, again, like Mercedes, we've seen it just doesn't work, even though they're in that top three as well. But Ferrari, it felt like the upgrade just wasn't really what they needed. It was just didn't quite fix the problems that they actually had. And it transpired that Lando Norris was simply bringing those hard compound tyres into a perfect window. And once Charles Leclerc had kind of put in those laps and tried to catch Lando Norris and didn't in the end have an answer to the pace of the McLaren car, he then just really dropped off again and was a distant third place from those top two. And you talk about Max Verstappen and Lando Norris being within a second of each other, maybe another lap Lando Norris would have swapped. Charles Leclerc wasn't in that battle. Charles Leclerc wasn't in that conversation. And that's where he needs to be. And that's where Ferrari need to be, especially when they're bringing upgrades like this. And they were coming from a point where, again, in the Constructors' Championship, they are still the second fastest car on paper. So it's a bit of a weird. And I know that both Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz complained that the team's ERS development wasn't up to scratch compared to Red Bull's and McLaren's. Like, they just couldn't quite get the balance right for it this weekend. And Carlos Sainz in particular, just, well, in qualifying, he complained that he wasn't really happy with the soft compound tyre, but then in the race, couldn't quite get the medium compound tyre to work in that first stint. Then obviously decided to go a little bit longer. That left him vulnerable to the undercut. And as I said, Carlos Sainz then lost out to Oscar Piastri by a good margin. And Oscar Piastri, if anything, looked like he was ready to battle with Charles Leclerc rather than worried about Carlos Sainz, who was behind. And I don't know, it's that balance of Ferrari again. They look like they're taking a step forward, then they take half a step backwards. I'm sure that come Monaco, they'll be right up there again. I'm not expecting them to completely fall off the pace compared to Red Bull and McLaren. But I do think that Verstappen and Norris, just over the first 7 races of this season, although Charles Leclerc has been in the mix, although Carlos Sainz did pick up the victory in Australia, it's just starting to look like those two are the standout two for me. And it's a bit weird, isn't it? Because Carlos Sainz did get that victory in Australia, but Lando Norris's victory in Miami, because Max Verstappen was at least still on the racetrack, just makes me feel slightly differently about it. And I know that they were both lucky. Obviously, Australia, Max Verstappen drops out of the Grand Prix, and in Miami, Max Verstappen drops behind the safety car, and the safety car comes at just the right time for Lando Norris. Like, they both incidents where Max Verstappen probably would have gone on to win, and they were lucky to get that victory. But yeah, I don't know. Just Max Verstappen actually finishing behind Lando Norris and not being able to catch Lando Norris in that final stint is very different to Carlos Sainz, who didn't have to battle with Max Verstappen or worry about Max Verstappen at all on that weekend. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of where I'm at with Ferrari. And I just feel like they are now that step behind McLaren, but McLaren still haven't caught them in the constructor standings, so it won't matter to them as such. And then I've mentioned Mercedes there a couple of times because I do feel like you still have to talk about Mercedes in that upper echelon, right? You still have to talk about Mercedes as being one of the biggest teams. Like, they are the engine supplier to McLaren, and usually a partner team is not ahead of the full works team, but in the case of McLaren and Mercedes, McLaren look like they are a mile ahead in terms of this rule cycle and understanding the regulations right now. And I don't know, like, obviously Peter has said here, Mercedes on their day can be good. And it did feel like, yeah, they finally found something. They definitely separated themselves out from, you know, the RBs. You look back to Miami and Hamilton is battling with Tsunoda and Russell is really struggling to fight through the midfield at points. And it definitely wasn't one of those weekends. They had a much cleaner weekend and finished all by themselves effectively, and finished ahead of one of the Red Bulls and comfortably ahead of one of the Red Bulls. It still doesn't feel like Mercedes are really moving in the direction that they want to, and it still doesn't feel like any upgrades they bring in comparison to the upgrades that people like Ferrari bring or McLaren bring. They seem to kind of jump ahead, and the Mercedes car is getting quicker. It's not getting quick enough, if that makes sense. Like, if McLaren find 2 tenths, Mercedes only find 1. And that's why they just keep creeping away from them in terms of it. And Dan No Skill, lovely to see you, mate. A quiet but consistent season if Ferrari can sort out their upgrades. That's very true. Charles Leclerc, is very consistent. Did make a little mistake, though, in Imola. Did think that was worth talking about when he was within that window of possibly having a little battle with Norris. Did make the mistake that just kind of cut that out completely. But that's the way that it kind of is. Where was I? Mercedes, yeah. I wanted to ask, actually, why did they do the driver swap at the end with George Russell? Like, I understand George Russell pitted, went behind Lewis Hamilton to get the fastest lap point, which he did, but then also he lost out. So George Russell lost out on a point to gain the team a point. And I suppose at this point in the season, they're not really battling for the Constructors' Championship. They're just trying to get enough points on the board so that they can just put Aston Martin effectively at arm's length, and Aston Martin are more likely to be battling with RB sometime soon than actually with Mercedes. But yeah, it just felt like Russell essentially sacrificed his intra-team victory, and when we look back at the season, we're going to say, oh, well, Hamilton's average finishing position was this, Russell's average finishing position was this, and we're going to have to kind of take Imola out. I know that they only finished side by side anyway, but still that switch of position is a little bit weird in my opinion. And yeah, it just felt like Russell wasn't totally on board with that sacrifice, but was still forced to follow that team order. And considering the gap that they had to Sergio Perez, it makes me wonder why Mercedes didn't do that with Hamilton. Like, did they not trust Hamilton to get the fastest lap point if he was on a fresh set of tires? Like, it was all a little bit strange. I suppose if there had been a safety car right after George Russell had pitted, then it would have played in his favor a little bit more, because he'd have been right behind the rest of the pack on a fresh set of medium tires, whereas everyone else was on very, very old hards. But then you'd imagine if there was a safety car, lots of the cars towards the front end of the grid would have probably gambled and come in under the safety car as well. It was a little bit strange. Who got the safety car? I missed that part. Who got the... There was no safety car. That's what I'm saying. If there was a safety car, it would have played into George Russell's role in kind of swapping tires. But yeah, strange risk, strange strategy choice, weird overall thing. Like, just didn't seem like a good decision to make, to be honest. And obviously, George Russell was comfortably ahead of Lewis Hamilton for the majority of the Grand Prix. So I'm not so sure he'll be very happy about that. Like, P6 should have been his. And I know P7, P6, at the end of the day, he's not going to look back at the end of his career and go, oh, I wish I had that P6 in Imola. Like, he's going to look back at the victories, the podiums, the standout moments. But yeah, it got to me a little bit. It was a bit weird. Tanya said this: Lance Stroll apparently can drive. His P9 is a bit crazy. And yeah, let's talk about Lance Stroll, because we often talk about him negatively, not gonna lie. Like China, if you go back to the Chinese Grand Prix hot takes, I think 1 in every 3 was about Lance Stroll smacking into the back of Daniel Ricciardo. Like, Lance Stroll does get a lot of flack when he's not really performing at the level that he should be. And the 2 points here, like, it's par for the course. It's what he probably could have expected, just about. Like, Aston Martin are still the 5th fastest car in Formula 1 on paper, and he was able to get the better of the RBs, and the RB car is like kind of the next down, and the RB is kind of separating itself out from the bottom 4 now. So RB are kind of in that 6th place quite comfortably. So RB would have definitely had an eye on Aston Martin, particularly because a man who we're going to talk about in a second, Fernando Alonso, had an absolute nightmare of a weekend. So the fact that Lance Stroll kind of came to their savior and made sure that they still outscored RB this weekend is significant, and he's owed a lot. Like, he made that first stint work, went super long on that medium compound tire, but didn't look ridiculously slow in comparison to the likes of Sergio Perez, who was going really long but on a set of hard compound tires. And he did his part. He brought home the car, managed to make those overtaking maneuvers stick right at the end of the Grand Prix, where he still needed to get past Ricciardo, Hulkenberg, Tsunoda. Okay, yes, he was on fresher tyres, but you still have to get those done. And I don't know, after a weekend like this, it looks like he could be worth it. It's so flip-floppy with Lance Stroll, isn't it? One weekend, he looks absolutely worth every single point. He looks like he could be a solid midfield driver. Other weekends, he throws points away. He just has terrible weekends. He throws the car in the wall, and you're just like, why on earth is this still in Formula One? And it really does just go back and forth. It's like a tennis match inside of Lance Stroll's mind. Obviously, if he wants to stay in Formula One, if he wants to justify himself, this needs to become the norm. Like, 9th place is where he should be finishing most weekends. Like, he should have been in the points every single weekend, in my opinion. Like, realistically, the gap between Aston Martin and RB, particularly at the beginning of the season, is closing a little bit now with RB bringing some upgrades and Tsunoda continually looking better and better and better. But really, if everything goes to plan and nobody has any real issues over the course of the weekend, Lance Stroll, I feel like, should be finishing 9th or 10th. That's, you know, if we put everybody on the grid and kind of simulated a race and a computer decided who should finish where, I feel like Lance Stroll would come out 9th or 10th pretty much all the time. And that's where he needs to be finishing. Problem with Stroll is that he's good or bad. There's no in between. That is also a good point. Yeah, that's very true. He either has a sublime weekend or a terrible weekend. There's never a 6 out of 10 for Lance Stroll, is there? He either does, you know, an 8, 9 out of 10 performance, or it is a 1, 2 out of 10 performance. Makes you wonder, could Fernando have done more without his skill issues this weekend? Ouch. Peter did say Aston Martin and Alonso is washed, which is a very hot take considering, you know, at the end of 2023, I think most people had Fernando Alonso in their top 3 or top 4 drivers of the season. He has only had one weekend where it really did fall apart this weekend. And okay, can he get away with it? Sort of. He's Fernando Alonso, but it did all start on Saturday morning, right? That error when it came to free practice 3. And that's kind of the takeaway moment, isn't it? Obviously, had a shot to get into Q2, then also made an error again in qualifying. So it was like error followed by error in session after session. It was very uncharacteristic to see 2 mistakes in a weekend from Fernando Alonso. And it should worry him a little bit, the fact that Aston Martin's development path doesn't seem to be getting it done right now. And he looks less and less comfortable in that Aston Martin car as they continue to develop it. Like, they brought a little bit of an upgrade this weekend. They flirted with a race win in Monaco last year, and we're moving into Monaco again this year, and it looks so far off the pace, right? It doesn't look like anyone is talking about Fernando Alonso winning a Grand Prix anytime soon. And that's kind of the drop-off. It's been a whole season now, and at the beginning of 2023, they were absolutely phenomenal. Everyone gave them their flowers. They did so well to come into that season and be quicker than Ferrari, be quicker than Mercedes, and put Fernando Alonso on the podium consistently. But they haven't been able to do that since sort of, Canada last year, I want to say. Or did Fernando Alonso eke out a podium in the Netherlands? Had a good race in Brazil. But again, they're kind of few and far between. There's no consistency in Fernando Alonso's performances. And then this year, they've been clearly the 5th fastest car. Fernando Alonso's been on damage limitation mode and has just been trying to get everything that he can out of that car, trying to keep himself within touching distance of the Mercedes in terms of the driver's standings. But for me, it just doesn't feel like he's going to be able to keep that pace, and is going to end up probably, 9th in the driver's standings, probably a good chunk ahead of 10th place, who's likely to be Yuki Tsunoda or Lance Stroll, but still in 9th place, kind of a little bit no man's land for Fernando Alonso. And I don't know, let's hope that there's a little bit better coming. Obviously, more upgrades coming. A multi-year contract just signed for Fernando Alonso. So they do have the ability to move in the right direction. We've seen them do it before, but they need to do it sooner rather than later. Otherwise, 2025 is also just going to kind of be a nothing season. They've got a real risk of turning into this season's Alpine. You know, when Alpine last year finished in 4th place, in 6th place, nowhere near 4th. They finished in 6th place, but they were miles ahead of 7th. but miles behind 5th. I feel like Aston Martin are almost kind of rolling in there. Like, they could end up finishing 5th, but they could end up finishing 5th. Like, they could be a couple 100 points off Mercedes in front of them, but also like 100 points ahead of RB behind them. You know what I mean? Like, could end up just being right in that spot where they're not fighting for anything. And at the end of the day, I feel like you'd rather be in a little bit of a fight with someone to give your drivers a bit more moving forwards. But yeah, I don't know. In his defense, the last few races have let him finish out of position. So one bad weekend, wouldn't say washed. Yeah, exactly. Fernando Alonso's been good. He is good. He is still in the top echelons of drivers on the grid. As I said, at the end of 2023, most people had him in their top 3 or 4. He doesn't drop off that quickly. You know, within 7 races, he isn't now completely not worth his seat, especially now that he's signed a long-term deal with Aston Martin as well. But Alonso has a habit of being negative when the car is not there. That's very true. Can compound. Obviously, you start being negative, you make one mistake, then it forces you into a second mistake. Then you start from the back of the grid. And again, in the race, he just didn't quite have the pace, didn't seem comfortable in the car. So starting from the pit lane was a bit of a waste of time as well. Yeah, it all just fell apart for Fernando. And talking of Fernando kind of signing a contract, I also did want to chuck in Alex Albon here, because Jive Wig said Sargeant was decent, but still slightly behind Albon in pace. Valtteri looks most likely to take his seat. And we do need to have a little bit of a discussion about the teams towards the back end. Obviously, I haven't discussed Yuki Tsunoda. I feel like it kind of goes without saying that Yuki Tsunoda is just doing amazing now. So I wasn't going to include him again, because I feel like every single week, all we say is Yuki Tsunoda and Nico Hülkenberg are the standout performers in that back of the pack battle, and they've done it once again. Like, Yuki Tsunoda finishing 10th, Nico Hülkenberg just outside the points again in 11th. It is those two, isn't it? Tsunoda and Hülkenberg are just a level above everybody else towards the back end of the grid this season so far. Daniel Ricciardo starting to enter that fray, but I think the discussion here around Williams and also the future of Logan Sargeant, especially considering what James Vowles has said this weekend, does start to make you question their moves forward. First and foremost, Alex Albon, the man on the screen. Obviously, massive news for Alex Albon and Williams to make sure that they've got him in a seat for the foreseeable future. Although that's a massive positive, it then turned into a pretty disastrous weekend for Alex Albon. I mean, the fact remains that the upgraded, weight shedded FW46, like, still is miles off the weight limit, still didn't look particularly convincing in terms of its race pace at Imola. And even before, obviously, you can throw in the fact that he had that pit stop wheel drama, whatever was going on there, the wheel not attached to the car properly. Even before that, his Grand Prix didn't feel like it was going to move towards Albon being closer to the likes of Tsunoda, Hülkenberg, maybe even Daniel Ricciardo. You know, that's where he wants to be. He wants to be battling with them. Esteban Ocon was in that mix again today. Like, definitely Albon wants to be moving in that direction. And RB's recent rise just means that Williams' quest to put Alex Albon in and amongst that conversation and start to actually pick up some points, because still no points on the board for Williams so far this year, just shows that Williams actually have quite a lot that they need to do to actually prove to Albon that his decision to stick with them for the foreseeable future is actually going to pay dividends in the future, if you know what I mean. Like, he wants to stick with the team. The team need to show him that that was a good choice to stick with them. And then it was interesting that Logan Sargeant was talked about by James Vowles. James Vowles said that Logan Sargeant knows what he needs to do. They've had very clear conversations between James Vowles, Logan Sargeant, his team behind him, about what he needs to do if he does want to keep that Williams seat. But James Vowles did also say that he is in discussions with other drivers. And again, we see Logan Sargeant. Okay, the Williams was pretty bad, but even with everything that was happening, Alex Albon's pace still looked a lot better. Alex Albon did drop out in Q1. Logan Sargeant did as well, but Logan Sargeant didn't manage to get an actual lap time on the board. So again, it's kind of a qualifying session disaster. Then in the race, he had stints where it looked like it was gonna maybe be okay, and then it just fell off again, and he fell off a cliff in terms of performance. Only finished he finished effectively last again of the runners that were actually doing a race strategy that made sense. Fernando Alonso started doing, I feel like, some testing for Aston Martin towards the end of the Grand Prix. Same with Alex Albon. He came into the pits quite a lot. It felt like a bit of a testing run for Alex Albon once he was a lap down after the first few laps of the Grand Prix. So it just felt like, I don't know, a weird weekend for Logan Sargeant. Definitely under even more pressure now. Definitely convinced nobody he is worth that seat. You know, it's not like he turned up and already turned up to Imola and just put a stamp of authority on that Williams seat. And then, yeah, there's the Valtteri Bottas links. I'd like to know what you guys think of Valtteri Bottas and the links to a possible Williams seat. I feel like that's a tricky one to gauge, to be honest. Valtteri Bottas, yes, he's worked with James Vowles before. Obviously, they were at Mercedes with each other. Yes, he's worked at Williams before. He was at Williams before he went to Mercedes. And to be fair, if Nico Rosberg hadn't have retired, Valtteri Bottas might have been like a one-team man. He might have just stayed with Williams throughout that entire time, right? You could see Bottas and George Russell probably being together in that car. And then, yeah, like George Russell moves on, then Albon comes in. Like Valtteri Bottas could have easily kind of stayed at Williams for a very, very long time. But does he go back to Williams? Does that work? He's definitely an upgrade on Logan Sargeant. Is he the best driver available to the Williams team? It depends who else they're in conversations with. It depends how much they're willing to pay. It depends what kind of contract they're offering. Like, do they have an eye on Zach O'Sullivan, for instance, in Formula 2, and maybe want to bring him in the way that they brought Logan Sargeant through their own academy and up into Formula 1? Do they want to do that with another one of their academy graduates? In which case, it would be probably a little bit of a shorter contract that they need to offer, and therefore Valtteri Bottas maybe is a good choice, because Valtteri Bottas might take a 2-year contract rather than a 3-year contract. I think that's the thing for Williams. They need to be very careful about what they want in the future, particularly moving into 2026. And as James Vowles has pointed out many a time, 2027, which is their kind of big landmark goal, right? They are trying to change a lot of the behind the scenes at Williams. They are trying to change a lot of the infrastructure and the people and everything effectively within that Williams team, so that by 2027, they're in the place they want to be. So it's a very long time until they are looking like they want to be where they want. Honestly, Alex Albon being convinced of that, there must be something that's happening at Williams that he is convinced will continue to grow, will continue to go in the right direction, and will offer him an opportunity, at least like consistent points by the time they get to 2026, 2027. Because otherwise, Alex Albon could definitely have moved to a bigger team. Like, Williams are not going to have the backing of, say, an Audi. And Audi have been talking about Alex Albon quite a lot. Obviously, they weren't able to get him in as of yet. Like, they signed Nico Hulkenberg. Then it was like, okay, are they waiting on Carlos Sainz? And by waiting for Carlos Sainz, they kind of missed out on their second choice in Alex Albon, in my opinion. And now they're looking at Carlos Sainz or probably an Esteban Ocon in that Audi seat. But that's kind of a bit of an interesting topic that has come up. Yuki Tsunoda deserves something better, in my opinion. That's also a good one, to be honest with you. I thought Yuki Tsunoda to Williams might be quite an interesting option if Williams can convince him to go there. But I think Yuki Tsunoda going anywhere, well, what's more competitive than RB right now? You could argue Aston Martin, but RB are moving in a really positive direction at this moment in time, whereas Aston Martin look to have kind of stagnated a little bit. And as I say, they're not quite sure where they're really going at Aston Martin, whereas whereas RB, Visa Cash App RB, seem to be moving in the right direction and seem to have a little bit of momentum behind them. And momentum is so important in Formula 1. We've seen it with McLaren. Like, you can carry momentum through a season and into the next season if you can continue to get quicker and quicker and quicker. It just kind of, the whole team, like, you get the positivity because you're going faster, and because you get that positivity, everyone works a bit harder, and then you get even faster, so you get even more positivity, and it's like that rolling cycle. Whereas Aston Martin are a little bit downbeaten at this moment in time. So I feel like if there is a team that is going to be able to catch Aston Martin, it's probably RB. Yuki Tsunoda's already there. Is he going to get a seat at Mercedes? I don't think so. McLaren already sorted. Ferrari already sorted. And I don't think he goes into Red Bull, as much as obviously the sister team is supposed to promote drivers into the main team. It just feels like Red Bull have never really been convinced by Yuki Tsunoda. And even with this incredible season that he is having, I don't know. I still can't see Yuki Tsunoda ending up in a Red Bull seat. It's kind of a weird thing because he is in a Red Bull sister seat, but I can just never ever see Yuki Tsunoda in a full Red Bull seat alongside Max Verstappen, even though I think that would actually be a really, really solid driver pairing if Yuki Tsunoda can continue the form that he has been on this season into next season. If he was in a Red Bull car, again, he doesn't pose a massive threat to Max Verstappen in my eyes, but I think, would he do a better job than Sergio Perez? That's where you have to kind of label it in, isn't it? It's like you have to kind of think about where it's going to go. In terms of the driver standing, though, Yuki Tsunoda has still put himself in the top 10. Obviously, missed out on a point, losing that place to Lance Stroll towards the end of the Grand Prix, but still on 15 to Lance Stroll's 11. Running all the way down, Max Verstappen still leads with 161 points. Charles Leclerc actually moves ahead of Sergio Perez into second place. He's on 113 to Sergio Perez's 107. Lando Norris now on 101 and also gaining on Sergio Perez pretty heavily in the last couple of weekends. Carlos Sainz on 93 and 20 points behind his teammate now, Carlos Sainz, where it was looking very, very close between the two of them. I know that he missed a Grand Prix in Saudi Arabia, but it's starting to look like he's falling off a little bit, and maybe it is that he's leaving Ferrari at the end of the season. Charles Leclerc is probably going to be getting quite a lot of the benefit in terms of upgrades, in terms of strategy, in terms of resources. Probably going very much in favor of Charles Leclerc, which Carlos Sainz does seem to be getting a little bit frustrated about. Oscar Piastri is an interesting one. 53 points, 40 points off the back of Carlos Sainz. And I don't know, I just didn't think Oscar Piastri was that far off, to be honest with you. Like, he finished 4th in Saudi Arabia. He's had a few good Grand Prix, was very, very quick in Miami. Obviously ended up finishing outside the points because of that incident with Carlos Sainz. But I don't know, Oscar Piastri miles off and closer to George Russell in 7th place on 44 points. Lewis Hamilton in 8th place on 35. Fernando Alonso picking up no points this weekend, stays on 33 and drops to 9th place. Then we have Behrman, the Behrman barrier, in 12th place with 6 points. Nico Hulkenberg so very close to jumping over the Behrman barrier, but not quite yet. Just missed out on points, finishing in 11th. Daniel Ricciardo also a huge haul, 5 points coming in the Miami sprint. Has kind of put him very close to getting over the Behrman barrier, but not quite yet. Esteban Ocon, 15th place with 1 point. Kevin Magnussen with 1 point as well so far this season. Albon, Joe, Gasly, Bottas, and Sargeant yet to score a point so far this season, which means the constructor standings, it's in a fairly obvious sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Like, I think the season is starting to spread now. We're starting to see a very clear hierarchy in terms of the drivers and in terms of the constructor standings, but Red Bull are in first place. Ferrari still hold on to second place, with McLaren looking to catch. But again, Oscar Piastri so far off compared to when comparing the points. I just didn't realize that he was kind of losing out so much to the Ferrari drivers ahead. Mercedes in 4th place, Aston Martin in 5th, and Mercedes have kind of very much put themselves away from Aston Martin now. RB on 20 points is the interesting one, right? Half as much as Aston Martin, but still a very long way to go and looking very competitive. Haas on 7 points, Alpine with the 1 singular point, Williams and Stake Sauber yet to score so far this season. And I really enjoyed Imola so far. I really enjoyed Imola in total, because it is done now, so no longer so far. Ferrari, okay, I was a little bit disappointed about. I thought they would maybe challenge this Sunday. Like, team boss Fred Vasseur said that they were going to be right up there, but he summed it up well, saying that after the race, it's good news. You know, Formula One is getting more competitive. They are getting closer. There's still things that they can do to improve, but we are seeing Max Verstappen at least under pressure right now. And, you know, it's less than 1/10 a lap. Max Verstappen isn't disappearing up the road ridiculously. He isn't 30 seconds ahead halfway through the Grand Prix anymore. He is at least within touching distance when things do go wrong, and when his tyres start to go off, we actually see it now rather than beforehand where it'd go from, okay, he was 20 seconds in the lead and he's now 15 seconds in the lead. But 3 different teams possibly capable of winning Formula One races, and I think that's the first time we've seen that since 2018, 2019, where it was Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes. Like, when's the last time we had 3 teams that were actually like fully capable of looking like they could win a Grand Prix? It's been a very, very long time, I think. And you no longer need to like tune in every weekend and pray something goes wrong for Max Verstappen. Instead, you just need to pray for like someone else to turn up and have a little bit of good fortune, as opposed to Max Verstappen just crashing out at the first corner or something ridiculous like that. Any final points? Boopy boop. I feel like Joe deserves a compliment because he had a decent race, in my opinion, until he didn't. He was in 12th for a bit. Yeah, he was on a bit of a weird strategy, though, wasn't he, Joe Guan Yu? Ended up finishing in 15th place, so don't know, maybe. Does feel like you can measure where your team is going and how good they are at their pit stops. Very true, yeah. The team is on an upward trajectory. I think that's that thing. If you have positivity around the team, your pit stops seem to go well. It was like that invincibility feeling of Max Verstappen last year. There was so much buzz around the team doing really, really well that everything they did seemed like it was just perfect. And therefore, that just spirals, right? You feel like you're invincible, so you start doing things a little bit better, then you feel even more invincible, and it just rotates through that kind of positivity filter. Logan is Gotifi's son. Not good for Logan Sargeant. How many seasons did Latifi get? Was it 3 in the end? Logan Sargeant, very unlikely to get 3, isn't he? 2 at the maximum, I feel like, for Logan Sargeant. Yeah, he's going to be out of a seat at the end of this season, just almost guaranteed. Another, well, 17th place. Oh, we did finish ahead of Valtteri Bottas, actually. I thought Logan Sargeant finished kind of last of the actual drivers, but no, 17th, did finish ahead of Valtteri Bottas, who is supposed to be replacing him. So maybe they shouldn't get Logan Sargeant in. Maybe Valtteri Bottas isn't an upgrade. Again, this is just one race, so I'm not sure I truly believe that. Thank you guys so much for watching, though. If you could leave a like, subscribe to the channel, all that good stuff. We're live again